My name is Bianca Andreescu. I'm 28 years old now, and this is the story I've been too afraid to tell anyone, even though it happened 5 years ago. I remember the exact moment I decided to stop trying. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was standing in the kitchen of my parents' house, holding a rejection letter from a design agency. The letter itself was polite, professional, even kind. They said my portfolio showed promising potential, but that they were moving in a different direction. Standard stuff. The kind of rejection everyone gets when they're starting out. But what I remember most wasn't the letter. It was my father walking in, reading over my shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, and then the sound of his laugh. Not a warm laugh, not even a mean laugh really, just this hollow, dismissive sound that somehow hurt more than if he'd screamed. "Still doing that design thing?" he asked, shaking his head as he moved past me to the coffee maker. I didn't answer. I never did anymore. But that morning I felt something break inside me that I didn't realize was still holding together. I was 23 years old, living in my childhood bedroom because I couldn't afford anything else, working as a barista 3 nights a week, and the only person in the world who was supposed to believe in me, or at least pretend to, thought my dreams were a joke. I stood there for a long time after he left, holding that letter, and I made a decision. I would stop talking about it. All of it. The design work, the freelance projects, the late nights teaching myself new software, the portfolio I was rebuilding. I would just stop saying anything and let them think whatever they wanted. That's the thing about silence that no one really talks about. It's not peaceful, it's exhausting. Let me back up. I need to explain what my life looked like before I stopped trying to explain anything. My parents weren't evil. That's the hardest part about this whole thing. They weren't villains in a story. They were just people. My father, Roberto, was an accountant. Practical, numbers made sense to him. Art did not. My mother, Juliana, was a nurse, and she was kind in the way that exhausted people are kind. Present but distracted, her empathy depleted by 12-hour shifts. I grew up in a decent house in a decent neighborhood. We had enough money. We had family dinners, though they were often tense. I was the middle child, which in my family meant I was the invisible one. My older brother, Marco, was smart in the way my father understood. He became an engineer. My younger sister, Francesca, was beautiful in the way my mother understood. She became a model and then married a lawyer. And then there was me. I was the one who drew. The one who stayed up until 3 a.m. redesigning the layout of websites I found online, not because anyone asked me to, but because something inside me needed asterisk to arrange things in a way that felt right. I was the one who took photographs of ordinary things, the way light hit a window, the pattern of cracks in concrete, and saw them as something more. By the time I was 18, I knew I wanted to be a graphic designer. Not in a vague, dreamy way. I'd researched it. I'd looked at colleges. I'd started teaching myself through free online courses. I had a plan. My father's response was to suggest I study something practical as a backup, something real. He said this kindly, like he was protecting me from myself. My mother nodded along while folding laundry. And when I insisted, stubbornly, maybe even arrogantly, that I was going to pursue design, they didn't forbid me. They just withdrew. The conversation stopped. The interest ceased. It was worse than fighting somehow. It was indifference wrapped in concern. I went to a state university for graphic design, took on student debt, graduated with a portfolio I was genuinely proud of, and then I spent 2 years applying to agencies, freelancing, building experience, working terrible service jobs to pay rent, the usual story for creative people in their 20s. By the time I was 23, I'd had maybe 7 decent client projects, nothing that made me rich, nothing that made me stable, but I was learning, growing, getting better. I could feel it. What I couldn't feel was support, so I moved back home, swallowed my pride, and tried to make it work while I figured out my next move. That's when the mocking started in earnest. It wasn't like they gathered around and made fun of me. It was smaller than that. A sigh when I mentioned I'd stayed up late working on a portfolio piece. A comment at dinner about how, at least the barista job is something steady. My father asking when I was going to get a real job. My mother wondering if I'd considered going back to school for something more stable like it. They didn't say, "We think you're a failure." They just said it in 17 different ways, every single day, until I believed it myself. I lived at home for 2 years, 2 years of this slow erosion, and then something happened that I didn't see coming at the time, something that seemed so small it was almost invisible. His name was David Chen, and he was the owner of the cafe where I worked. He was maybe 40, quiet, and almost never came in during my shifts. But one Thursday night in November, he stopped by around 10 p.m. while I was closing. I was having a genuinely bad night. My father had made some comment at dinner about how, at least your job at the cafe keeps you humble, and I was trying not to cry while wiping down the espresso machine. I was wearing my barista apron, my feet hurt, there was a stain on my sleeve that I couldn't get out. David came to the counter and I automatically started getting his order, but he stopped me. "Let me see your phone," he said, just like that, no preamble. I thought he was strange, I almost said no, but something in his voice made me do it. I handed him my phone, confused. He opened my photos and scrolled through them for what felt like forever, all my photographs, the ones I took at 6 a.m. on my walks, the ones I edited late at night, the ones I'd never shown anyone because I was too embarrassed. When he handed my phone back, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You have real talent. Whatever you're doing besides photography, stop doing it and do this instead." Then he left. I didn't even process it for weeks. It was such a strange, brief interaction, and David was such a quiet, unassuming person that it felt almost unreal. But it lodged somewhere in my brain. It stayed there. Around the same time, something started to shift in my parents' behavior. Small things. My mother became quieter than usual. Not the distracted quiet I was used to, but something sadder. And my father, he started having these conversations with her behind closed doors. I'd hear the murmur of voices and then silence, and I'd know they were talking about something they didn't want me to hear. I was 25 years old. I should have been moving forward. Instead, I was regressing, trapped in my childhood bedroom, feeling the weight of their disappointment like a physical thing. One Sunday, my mother asked me to come upstairs. My father was sitting on their bed, and my mother looked like she'd been crying. "We need to tell you something," she said. My father had been having an affair, for 7 years, with someone I knew, the wife of one of his college friends. My mother had just found out, and apparently she'd found out because the other woman had ended it, and my father had been trying to figure out how to tell my mother for weeks, which is why they'd been fighting, which is why both of them had been so distant and angry, which is why they'd been even more viciously dismissive of everything in my life. They weren't mocking me because I was a failure. They were mocking me because they were both in pain, and I was an available target. This realization didn't make me feel better, it made me feel worse. Things fell apart after that. My parents didn't divorce immediately, but something broke in their marriage that didn't get fixed. My mother started therapy. My father moved out for 3 months. The house became this place of quiet devastation, and I was still there in the middle of it, still trying to figure out my own life while theirs was imploding. My mother confided in me, which was both necessary and deeply inappropriate. She'd tell me things late at night when she couldn't sleep, how she'd missed the signs, how stupid she felt, how she thought maybe it was because she was always tired from work, because she never looked attractive anymore. The weight of her pain became my pain. My father, when he came back to the house to pick up things or talk to my mother, would sometimes get angry at me about seemingly small things. Once, he raised his voice because I'd left a dish in the sink. I was 25 years old, and I apologized like I was 7. And through all of this, I was supposed to still believe in myself. I was supposed to still pursue design. But it was hard to believe in yourself when the two people who made you are barely holding themselves together. I stopped going to my freelance projects. I told myself I was depressed, which was true. But really, I was trying to disappear. I worked my barista shifts. I came home. I stayed in my room. I deleted the design software from my laptop. The dark secret came later. Not much later, maybe a year after I found out about the affair, but it was the thing that made everything make sense and also made everything worse. My mother finally asked my father if there were other affairs, if there had been other women. He hesitated before answering, and then he told her the truth. The woman he'd been with for 7 years wasn't the only one. There had been others over the course of their marriage, over the course of my entire life. And the reason he'd been so dismissive of me, so mocking of my dreams, wasn't really about my dreams at all. My mother told me this while we were sitting in her car in the Whole Foods parking lot, and she said it like she was confessing something that would break me. "I think he was projecting," she said quietly. "I think when he saw you trying, pursuing something, believing in yourself, I think it reminded him of what he'd thrown away, and it made him angry. He had wanted to be a musician when he was young, before he met my mother. before he settled down and got serious and became an accountant. And he'd spent 30 years resenting the choice he'd made. And he'd spent those 30 years trying to convince everyone around him, especially me, that dreams were foolish, that stability was all that mattered, that the practical choice was the only choice that made sense. Because if my dreams were foolish, then maybe his were too, and that would make the life he'd actually lived feel like less of a waste. After my mother told me that, I didn't cry, I didn't get angry, I just felt tired, so tired. I was 26 years old, and I realized I'd let my father's failure become my failure. I'd let his bitterness poison the one thing that was actually mine, my own capacity to hope. Things got darker after that. I'm not going to describe it in detail because I don't think the details are the important part, but I will say that I stopped going to work. I stopped eating regularly. I stopped taking showers. I spent 3 weeks in my childhood bedroom barely leaving, and the only reason I finally left was because my mother came in one night and just sat on the edge of my bed and cried. "I can't lose you too," she said. "I can't." And I realized that my collapse was becoming hers as well, that by trying to disappear, I was hurting the one person in my family who hadn't hurt me on purpose. The next morning I got up, I showered, I called my therapist and asked for an emergency appointment. I drafted an email to my boss asking if I could come back to work, and then I did the hardest thing. I didn't know what to do next. It was David who reminded me. I ran into him at a grocery store of all places. He was picking up vegetables, and I was trying to figure out if I could afford the organic apples, and he just appeared. "Bianca," he said. He remembered my name. "How are you?" And I just broke. Right there in the produce section of a grocery store, I started crying. I told him everything, well, not everything, but enough. I told him I'd given up. I told him I wasn't doing photography anymore. I told him I didn't believe in myself anymore. He listened, and then he said something simple. "That's a shame because I remember your photographs, they were beautiful." "You remember that?" I asked, shocked that he'd even been paying attention. "I remember," he said. "I've thought about it a lot, actually. I own a cafe, Bianca, but I used to want to be a gallery owner. I gave it up because it seemed impractical. And then 5 years ago I saw your photographs and I regretted that choice. So I said it out loud to someone, to you, and I think I was hoping you wouldn't make the same mistake I did." He paused and then he asked, "Did it help? Did it change anything?" I wanted to lie, I wanted to say yes, but I said not really. I still stopped. "Why?" he asked. And I realized I didn't have a good answer. I'd stopped because my parents had never believed in me. But my parents had also stopped believing in themselves, and that was their tragedy, not mine. That conversation, which took maybe 5 minutes in the middle of a grocery store, became the moment everything shifted. I didn't magically heal. I didn't suddenly become a successful designer. What I did do was take small steps. I moved out of my parents' house. I found a roommate through a Craigslist ad. I got a studio apartment in the arts district of the city, and it was tiny and had one window that looked at another building. But it was mine. I reopened my photography Tumblr, which had been dormant for 3 years. I took that advice David had given me about focusing on photography, and I started building a portfolio of real work. I took a job at a marketing firm as a junior designer, not my dream job, but a stepping stone, and I started getting regular clients for photography work through my Tumblr. The thing is, I didn't do these things to prove anyone wrong. I did them because David's simple statement, "You have real talent," had planted a seed that didn't need to be watered with spite or revenge. It just needed to exist. My relationship with my parents didn't heal quickly. It healed slowly, awkwardly, with a lot of unspoken things. My father eventually went to therapy, and he apologized to me in the way that people who aren't good at emotions apologize, carefully, reluctantly, but genuinely. He said he was sorry for the way he'd treated my ambitions. He said he'd been wrong. He said he was proud of me. I cried when he said it, but not because I finally felt validated. I cried because I realized that my pain had been real, and his apology was real, but neither of those things could change the 5 years I'd lost. What they could do was change the next 5 years, and the 5 years after that. Here's the twist, the thing that makes everything click into place in a different way. 2 years ago, I was doing really well. I'd been promoted to senior designer at the marketing firm. My photography work was getting noticed. I was building something real. And I got contacted by a woman named Sarah who ran a small design consulting firm specializing in non-profit work. She said she'd found my portfolio online, and she wanted to talk about creating a design mentorship program for young, underrepresented designers who couldn't afford formal design school. She wanted me to help lead it. I agreed to meet with her, and when we sat down, she told me something that completely reframed this entire story. Her daughter had been a designer too, had been, past tense. The daughter had had demanding parents who didn't believe in her work. She'd given up on design and gone to law school instead. She was now a lawyer making 6 figures, and she was miserable. And Sarah had spent years watching her daughter's light dim, and she'd realized that if she could help other young designers not make that choice, then maybe it would mean something. "Your story," Sarah said, "is the reason I'm doing this. I don't know your parents, but I know 1,000 parents like them. And I know 1,000 kids like you who gave up because they believed their parents' version of reality instead of their own." And that's when I realized I wasn't the only one. Every struggle I had, someone else was having it too. Every moment I'd felt broken and alone, there were other people breaking and healing at the exact same moment. The mentorship program has been running for 2 years now. I've helped 17 young designers, mostly women, mostly from immigrant families, mostly carrying the weight of expectations that weren't their own, find their confidence again. Last month, one of them, a girl named Maya, 24 years old, brilliant and terrified, showed me a design project she'd completed. It was for a non-profit that helps undocumented immigrants. It was beautiful and purposeful, and exactly the kind of work that changes people's minds about what design can be. She told me she'd almost quit. She'd almost gone back to school for something her parents would understand, but she'd remembered something I'd told her. Your parents' belief in you is not the currency that validates your work. Your own belief, combined with the belief of people who actually understand what you're doing, is all you need. And I realized that was the real story. Not that I succeeded despite my parents' mockery, but that I eventually found success because I learned to hear the voices that mattered, David's voice, my own voice, and eventually the voices of people I helped. My parents and I have dinner together once a month now. It's not the same as if they'd always been supportive. There's a distance there that will probably never fully close, but my father asks about my work, genuinely curious. My mother talks about the photography shows I've had, and they know their daughter finally as someone who didn't give up. The last time we had dinner, my father told me that he'd enrolled in a beginner guitar class. He was 68 years old and had never owned a guitar, but he was learning. "Why now?" I asked. "Because I watched you rebuild," he said, "and I realized I could too. Doesn't matter that I'm old, doesn't matter that I'll never be a musician, but I can learn, and that's something." I didn't say anything to that. But on my drive home, I thought about how pain is often passed down like an inheritance, and how sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is refusing to give it to the next person. I thought about David, who I still see occasionally, who told me I had talent when I needed to hear it from someone who wasn't family, someone without skin in the game, and I thought about how a 5-minute conversation in a grocery store had somehow become the hinge upon which my entire life turned. And I thought about Maya and the 16 other young designers I've worked with, and I realized that my parents' mockery had been the worst thing that happened to me, and also, somehow, it had made me better at hearing people who needed to be heard. Not because healing always makes you better, but because sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to transform your worst moment into someone else's turning point. That's not the same as a happy ending, but it's something like grace. And when I wake up now, in my apartment in the arts district with my one window, I don't feel bitter about the 5 years I lost. I feel grateful for the person I became because I had to fight so hard to become her. That's the real story, not the mocking, not the success, but the quiet, stubborn, painful work of learning to believe in yourself when everyone else has stopped, and then when you finally do, learning to give that belief to others. That's the part that stays with me. That's the part that will always matter more than whether my parents were proud.